take up before we invite the jurors to continue and conclude the cross-examination of Mr. Sims?
Just, I wondered if there'd been any in-camera review based on the inquiry I made yesterday about the stains on the back gate, Your Honor.
All right, that matter was delegated to Mr. Douglas, and Mr. Douglas is just arriving. We'll take that up at an appropriate time.
Could we have just a moment? There's a scheduling problem that I wanted to alert you to. It doesn't have to be on the record, but I have to tell you about it today, Your Honor.
Come on down. All right, thank you, counsel. Anything else we need to put on the record before we invite the jurors to join us? And Mr. Scheck, do you know what you're going to need in the way of exhibits? Because we've got sort of a zoo over here right now.
Yeah, I think I have it fairly well planned. I'm going to start with that.
All right, I'm just
chart.
a little concerned because the smaller easel is just sort of leaned up here.
Oh, okay. I'll just get that.
Just a matter of logistics here. All right, Deputy McNair, let's have the jurors, please.
Chart and number. I don't remember. In every month.
All right, let the record reflect that we've now been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Did we enjoy our activities over the weekend? Okay. That was something I wanted to do myself. That's how you got that. All right, Mr. Sims, would you resume the witness stand, please? All right, good morning again, Mr. Sims.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Mr. Sims, you were reminded, sir, you were still under oath, and Mr. Scheck, you may continue with your cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Morning, Mr. Sims. How are you, sir?
Fine, thank you.
Your Honor, I'd like to start by marking a chart that I think has a label over the top, defense hypothetical, is defendants next in order. And I think
1165.
1165, and ask Mr. Harris to project that. And I'll approach the witness. Now, Mr. Sims, you recall on Thursday afternoon, we reviewed based on a hypothetical that I gave you concerning an assumption of random distribution of biological material over the swatches, you made a series of estimations or approximations of the amount of human DNA in various items of evidence. Do you recall that?
Yes, and I recall too the assumption as to how much of the total swatch I was getting was part of this calculation.
That's correct.
Because that's part of your assumption, but that wasn't in my original notes.
I understand. There were
Okay.
we made some assumptions about numbers of swatches and weights of those swatches that were not in your possession, but were in the possession of Cellmark.
Okay.
All right. But based on those figures, you made these estimations, correct? As reflected in defendant's
1165.
1165.
Well, these numbers do look similar to what I said, although I don't recall the specific numbers.
Right. You recall that we, I think on Friday, I handed you a copy of this chart, and at that time you checked it against your numbers.
It looks reasonable to me.
Okay. And just to review then, that in terms of, on the left-hand column, that reflects nanograms of human DNA.
Now this is now on the left-hand side of the,
Yeah.
yes,
This is
that,
nanograms.
well, that's, now on 117, it's important to note that I did not run a specific human test on that my quantitation was only based on a yield gel on 117.
But in terms of your yield gel showed little bacterial DNA. It looked to you human.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, and just so we're clear on this, 47, 48, 49, 50, and 52 are the items that were recovered on June 13th from the Bundy walkway.
Yes.
And 117 is the material that was found on the rear gate on July 3rd.
Yes.
And now, in this FBI report about environmental effects of DNA, do you recall that they reached a conclusion with respect to exposure to sunlight eventually causes degradation of DNA in stains to the point that no typing results can be obtained?
Which which particular FBI study is that? Is that in the Journal of Forensic Sciences or?
Yes, I'm referring that to, I don't know if it was ever given an item number in evidence, but call your attention to page 1646.
Mrs. Robertson doesn't recollect that study.
Yes, this is an article entitled,
Yes, this is the Comey article, November 91, Journal of Forensic Sciences.
How do you spell the name?
Comey.
Thank you.
and does that refresh your recollection as to the conclusion they reached with respect to the exposure to sunlight? What that can do in terms of degradation?
I'd like one moment just to review it.
Take your time.
Are we talking about sunlight or ultraviolet?
Sunlight.
Okay.
And I think you previously testified on direct examination that exposure to soil and dirt can lead to bacterial degradation of DNA in a blood stain.
Yes.
Now, finally, with respect to this chart, let's go back to the sock for a second.
Okay.
And you recall there was a cutout of about 3/4 of an inch to a half-inch high in the ankle of one of those socks.
Yes.
And as you indicated before, there was even some what appeared to be reddish staining or blood that was still on the sock in the area where the cutout had been made.
Yes, around the edges, there's still a little bit of staining there.
And when you received the sock from the Los Angeles Police Department, you found swatches inside a tube that had been cut by Greg Matheson.
Yes.
And you used How many of those swatches?
I used 3 of the 4.
3 of the 4. And on just 3 of those swatches, when you did a slot blot analysis, you came up with 1,350 nanograms of human DNA.
Well, now that was not a slot blot, that was a yield gel.
Yield gel.
Yield gel analysis.
But there was no evidence in your yield gel analysis of bacterial degradation in that sock.
No, I don't recall seeing any.
And so if one were to, so that's just 3 of the 4 stains where you got that 1,350 nanogram estimate from the yield gel.
Yes.
Now, if we were to plot what 1,350 nanograms look like in terms of this chart, you would have, wouldn't you agree, one of these red bars that would go like right through the top of the screen.
Yes, it would.
And it would be fair to say that the amount of DNA in that cutout section of the sock was a comparatively concentrated sample, I think were your words last week.
Yes.
Okay. Now, you did not receive the socks for testing at your laboratory until September 26th,
That's,
1994.
I believe that's the correct date.
And so on September 21st, 1994, you had no DNA results consistent with the DNA typings of Nicole Brown Simpson from that sock.
That's correct.
So to the best of your knowledge, there would be absolutely no factual basis for anyone saying on September 21st, 1994, that DNA tests had been performed on the socks and results had been obtained.
Objection, hearsay,
Sustained.
argumentative, no foundation.
Sustained.
To your knowledge, has anyone in your laboratory, including yourself, ever communicated DNA test results to members of the press prior to communicating them to the prosecution of the court?
Objections irrelevant, false for hearsay, no foundation.
Oh, you can answer that question, yes or no.
No.
And obviously, as far as you know, no one from your laboratory, including yourself, ever said on September 21st before you...
Sustained. Sustained.
All right. I think we're finished with that chart. Just a few more quick questions on precautions against contamination in the laboratory. Could you tell the jury what a laminar flow hood is?
Yes, a laminar flow hood is one that is designed such that when you're working inside of it, nothing gets into it and nothing gets out of it, because it basically creates a curtain of air that is like a barrier to keep things from either getting in or getting out of that hood.
Could you describe the air flow in that hood, how it works?
Yes, it's sort of a circular flow process, so that it's sort of hard to explain. I'll try to do this, but I think if you all know what a hood is, you're inside, it's an enclosed area inside, like a little case that you're working in. And the airflow is such that it is sucked down to form this curtain, and then it goes back through the back of it, it goes through a filter system, and then it comes back down around. So you've always got this barrier of air that keeps things from getting in and getting out. And when I say things, I'm talking about dusts and aerosols and that sort of thing.
And you literally would stick your hand through these, there's like holes that you stick your hand in?
Well, it's an opening. It actually is an opening. So you are putting your hands through that opening.
Putting your hands in that are gloved.
Yes.
And that's where you will do your work for the extractions?
Now that is where we always do our PCR setups.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we do the setups for the PCR amplification.
And the hood that you use, is the airflow such that you suck air from inside the laboratory into the hood and then out?
No, it's continuously recirculating the air as I understand it.
Mm-hmm. And is there something called a fume hood?
Yes, there is.
And a fume hood is a hood where you suck air from inside of the laboratory into the thing and then out.
Yes, and that's used when we're doing, for example, the phenol chloroform extractions, because you don't want to breathe this phenol. It's not a good, or chloroform for that matter either. Those are chemicals you don't want to breathe, and so you work in a fume hood to remove those fumes away from yourself.
But there's a difference between a fume hood and a laminar flow hood.
Yes,
And a laminar flow hood is the one that's specifically designed to prevent aerosols and particulates from inside the laboratory from getting inside that hood.
or from things in there getting out, both ways.
Okay.
You want to spell laminar for the court reporter?
Yes, L-A-M-I-N-A-R, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Now, we had a discussion about PCR carryover contamination on, I think it was Friday morning.
Yes,
And we talked about those billions of fragments.
yes,
And just to be clear about it, I was asking about the visibility of those fragments. Do you recall that?
yes,
And you said that they were invisible.
yes.
All right, and just so that we're very clear, they're in a liquid, is that correct?
Well, yes, they would be in a liquid, and so the only thing you could see would be if you got a droplet or something like that on a glove. You could see them as part of that drop, but you don't really see the particles. They're too small.
And the smallest amount of that could contain thousands of amplicons, as they're called.
Yes.
Now, we talked a little bit about methods that one would pursue in trying to determine whether you had contamination in your laboratory. You recall that?
Yes.
Now, if you had in your laboratory contamination such that you could see on your DQ alpha strips, and we'll review those strips in a minute, but they have all these dots on them, right?
Yes.
And if you saw that some of the dots were lighting up with pretty significant intensity that you knew shouldn't be lighting up in your quality assurance standards, your quality control standards, or your positive controls, that would be a strong indication that there was contamination in your laboratory.
If there were no other reason for that. For example, I've seen reference blood samples where somebody's been transfused, which creates a mixture situation. That would be one example. Also, as I pointed out earlier, sometimes with this DQ alpha system, you will see some very weak dots because of what's called cross-hybridization phenomenon. So those things you have to always take into account, but there are certain things you look for. For example, in your extraction reagent blank, your negative controls, if you see any dots in those, then that would signal that you have some form of contamination. That's the best thing to look at.
Before we go into some of those things you mentioned, I'm just asking you about a pretty simple situation where you see on the negative control, the positive control, and your quality control samples, dots of not faint but reasonably strong intensity are lighting up in a series of cases.
Yes.
Got that in mind?
Yes.
All right. And that would be certainly an indication that there may well be a contamination in your laboratory.
Yes, that would tell you that you may have a contamination problem.
And let us further, now would one procedure one would follow to try to get to the source of that contamination to look at the lots from which the reagents or chemicals came from?
Yes.
What could you tell the jury again what a lot is?
A lot is, excuse me, the way we set up our laboratory is we work with these lots of these kits that are provided by a commercial provider. And so we divide each shipment of those kits into a lot. And each kit includes reagents such as the cocktail. I guess Dr. Cotton has talked about this, so I won't go into it in detail. But they have the various reagents that are used as part of this kit. We also have lot numbers for the reagents that are used to extract DNA in our laboratory. So that would be a lot of reagents that we would check out also.
Let's just focus for a second on the lots of reagents that come in those kits.
Okay.
And those kits are provided by a company that's now known as Roche. biomedical.
Yes, it's Roche Molecular Systems,
Systems.
and then it's marketed by PerkinElmer.
And let us assume in this hypothetical I gave you about searching for the source of contamination, that one develops a hypothesis that maybe the source of contamination are those kits, the lots from those kits. Are you with me?
Yes.
All right. And you go back to the manufacturer, and you determine that there are no reports of any contamination being discovered in those kits.
Okay. In other words, the other users around the country are saying we didn't see that in that lot number.
Yes, and there's a person named Dr. Rebecca Reynolds, or Rebecca Reynolds, I don't know if she's a doctor.
Yes, I know. She is a doctor.
Dr. Rebecca Reynolds. And she would be actually the person you would call to check out whether or not a lot was contaminated from Roche or PerkinElmer.
She's one of the people that you might talk to, yes. There are other people there, too, that we would go through.
And if in this situation you learned from Rebecca Reynolds or some other person that there was nothing wrong with these lots.
Irrelevant.
Sustain. Directly with this laboratory's usage.
I'm sorry?
It's
Yes.
not relevant, unless it's directed towards this lab's
Yes.
usage.
Right. In terms of your usage, if you determined in a search for contamination from Roche that there was nothing wrong with the kits or lots, would that then lead you to search further for the source of contamination?
Objections irrelevant, improper, hypothetical, no foundation.
Or will.
Yes.
You want to spell Roche and PerkinElmer for the court
Roche,
reporter?
R-O-C-H-E. And PerkinElmer, now this may be harder for me, P-E-R-K-I-N-E-L-M-E-R. Let's discuss for a few minutes proficiency testing.
Okay.
Did you see Dr. Cotton's testimony with respect to the different kinds of proficiency testing?
I think I do remember a chart about blind. I think it was one that Mr. Neufeld prepared.
Yes.
I remember him writing. I have an image of that, yes.
Okay, just for benefit. I think this is Mr. Neufeld's writing, and it would be 1153. Can you see that in the back? I guess not. Let me just take a second. I'll move this over here.
Better,
Better?
better.
Now, would you agree with...
But you're also standing between it and
Right.
165.
And that's actually not going to be visible to them. Let's see. That, is that, see that? And can you?
All right, Mr. Scheck, if you would, let me address the jurors directly.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Now, this even has Mr. Neufeld's bad spelling, as I recall it. Now, would you agree that in terms of the generic types of proficiency tests, that one type is what's known as an open test,
Yes.
and that's where the examiners know they're being tested,
Yes.
and then there are blind tests where the examiners don't know that it's a test?
Yes, that's my general understanding, and I think in the Twig-Dam guidelines, that's what's mentioned as open versus blind.
All right. And then there are external tests where the samples are provided to the laboratory by individuals who are independent of the laboratory and don't necessarily know the strengths and weaknesses of the lab.
Yes.
And then there are internal tests which are provided by the laboratory to test itself.
Yes.
And then, of course, so there would be open externals, open internals, then blind externals and blind internals.
Yes.
Okay. So we're clear on that terminology.
Yes.
Now, with respect to the proficiency tests Withdrawn. Would you agree that as much as possible, one would want proficiency tests to duplicate or replicate casework, to be like casework?
Yes, I think as a concept, I would agree with that.
And that in terms of all those kinds of tests, the form of testing that would be most like casework would be an external blind test.
Well, I suppose if one makes a distinction between whether or not one knows one is being tested, is that
Yes.
that's probably true. Yes.
And would you agree that proficiency tests provides one way to measure the error rate of a DNA laboratory?
Yes.
And would you agree that in clinical work, DNA laboratories will often find out they made errors when doctors notify them that an incorrect diagnosis was made?
Sustain.
Well, you indicated on direct examination that you had some familiarity with the use of DNA typing processes in clinical medicine.
Yes, a very general familiarity.
Well, in a general way, wouldn't you agree that a DNA typing laboratory that is doing work for doctors in clinical medicine can find out that they made an error in their DNA typing results if the doctor calls them and says, your predicted result did not match what we found when we actually did some further tests on the patient?
Relevant, improper foundation.
Sustain.
Well, would you agree that in forensic work, it's harder to determine if a laboratory made an error in casework than in clinical medicine?
Restriction, false speculation, inadequate foundation.
Sustain.
Well, based on your general knowledge of clinical medicine, would you agree, and DNA typing in clinical medicine, would you agree that in forensic work, it's harder to determine whether a laboratory made an error than it is in clinical medicine?
Sustain.
Thank
You don't seem to like this line. Okay.
I didn't Friday either.
Yeah. We'll get to this, I suppose, with other witnesses.
Not through this witness.
Would you agree that in a proficiency test, even if you don't get a wrong answer, that the test can reveal weaknesses and discrepancies in a laboratory's work that are important to note because they could lead to errors in other situations?
Objection, argumentative, compound.
Overruled.
I think I'd need a little more like an example of where you're going with that. I'm not sure I understand the question otherwise.
If you take a proficiency test and there are some discrepancies in your typing results, let's say some evidence of contaminants or irregularities on a dot blot for DQ alpha, for example, but they don't prevent you on that particular test from getting a wrong answer. Are you with me?
Yes.
It's still important to note what those discrepancies or irregularities are, because on another test with another set of samples, those could lead to errors.
Yes.
And that's one of the things that proficiency tests can help a laboratory identify.
Yes, I agree.
Now, the only proficiency tests that have been conducted in your laboratory from external sources are open proficiency tests.
Yes.
And you're familiar with the recommendation, the section of the National Academy of Sciences report that talks about laboratory error rate?
I've read that section, yes.
And is that a section that you would rely upon in forming your opinions concerning laboratory error rates in external blind proficiency testing?
Well, the problem that I have with regards to the NRC is they're not clear on what a blind test is in their own definitions.
Have you ever looked at the glossary of terms at page 171 of the NRC report?
Objections, hearsay. on
Sustained.
721.
All right. Let me call your attention to page 171 of the NRC report.
Objection, calling to attention is irrelevant. It's hearsay at this point.
So, well, he can direct his attention to something and attempt to lay a foundation here.
Could you please read that section to yourself?
Mr. Harmon, do you have that?
Excuse me.
Do you have that? All right.
Okay.
Now, you just said that one of the problems you thought you had with the NRC report is the way they defined the different kinds of proficiency testing?
Yes, it is.
Objection, inadequate foundation is hearsay.
That question is not overruled.
Would you agree that in the glossary of terms that the NRC defines the
Objection,
different kinds of...
Sustained.
Hearsay.
All right.
Sustained.
Would you rely upon the definition in the glossary section at page 171 of the NRC report in terms of its definition of proficiency testing?
Objection is irrelevant, calls for hearsay.
Sustained. The question is not appropriately phrased, Counsel. It's not prospective. It's have you.
Have you relied on the section in the glossary, definition section of the glossary, for forming your opinions about what the NRC means with respect to proficiency tests and how they're defined?
Objection is irrelevant, inadequate
Sustained.
foundation.
In forming your opinions with respect to proficiency testing and DNA testing, would you rely upon the glossary section definition of the NRC report in forming
Sustained.
your opinions? Looking at the glossary section, does that refresh your recollection as to how the NRC defines proficiency tests?
Objection is argumentative, it's
Sustained.
hearsay.
Have you relied on the definition section of the NRC report with respect to proficiency testing?
Objection, calls for hearsay, inadequate foundation, it's vague.
Overruled.
Thank you.
Have I relied on the NRC to tell me what those definitions are? Is that the question?
Yeah, would you rely-
Because the answer to
have you-
that is no. I would not
You have your own
necessarily rely on
definitions.
this.
All right, but you gave us testimony a second ago about what you thought the NRC meant, how it defined proficiency testing.
Well, that's correct.
All right. In deciding what the NRC meant about different kinds of proficiency testing, had you previously relied on the definition section in the glossary?
Objection, that's irrelevant, compound, unintelligible, it's argumentative.
Overruled.
Not in the definition section, but there's other places in this writing where it's very confusing to me.
Well, does the definition section clear it up?
This is what I think is correct.
And that is what is also reflected on our charts that Dr. Cotton gave.
Yes.
Okay. Now, getting to the section of the report that deals with laboratory error rates.
Objection, it's hearsay at this point.
I'm only asking him about whether he's...
Overruled. This is foundational, I assume.
All right. the section of the report dealing with laboratory error rates, starting on page 88 to page 89. Do you rely upon the National Academy of Sciences report with respect to laboratory error rates, how laboratory error rates should be measured? Do you rely upon that in forming your opinions concerning error rates in DNA typing?
On I think I need more definition from you on that. I mean, are they saying that you should take a look at proficiency rates or proficiency error rates? I would agree with that.
All right. Do you rely upon that section which states that error rates ought to be determined through external blind proficiency
Sustained.
testing?
Sustained.
Can we
That's
approach
an
it
inappropriate way to phrase that
All
question,
right.
counsel. No.
Do you-
Have a seat, Mr. Harmon.
Let me call your, I'm sorry.
I was asking Mr. Harmon to have a seat.
Let me call,
But, counsel, we're not getting anywhere with this. Why don't you just ask him about the advantages, disadvantages, about the different types of proficiency testing, and let's move on.
all right.
The NRC report is not coming in through this witness.
Well, if he agrees with it.
Has to rely upon it in forming his opinions, counsel.
Would you-
You don't have the foundation.
All right. Let me just look, just call your attention. You're saying some parts of what they discuss about laboratory error rates you would rely upon?
No, you asked me what I agree with them, I think, is what
No,
they...
no, unfortunately, I can't ask you that question. I have to ask you the question, have you relied upon those sections of the NRC report dealing with how to measure laboratory error rate in forming your opinions?
No.
Okay. Thank you for the no. Now, in terms of, you took a few proficiency tests, external proficiency tests that were provided to you by the College of American Pathology and the Collaborative Testing Service.
Actually, the collaborative testing service is correct. The other ones that we did were through the United Kingdom branch of Cellmark.
Okay. Now, in either the, there's an acronym for the IQAS is the Cellmark acronym?
I don't use it, but I think there is an International Quality Assurance Scheme or something like
So
that.
there's the IQAS proficiency tests and the so-called CTS proficiency tests.
Yes.
And these are open tests.
Yes, they are done as open tests.
Now, in these tests, did you receive degraded samples, samples that were substantially degraded as specimens to analyze?
No, I don't, in the ones I looked at, no.
All right? But it is substantially degraded specimens that we're dealing with, certainly with respect to the Bundy blood drops in this case.
Well, I don't think number 52 was substantially degraded. I think some of the other Bundy drops, I would agree with that. 47, 48, 49, and 50, I think would be correct. But 52, I don't think was substantially
All right?
degraded.
It was, you don't like the word substantially there?
Well, that's, yes, I would draw the line there.
All right? How would you characterize the degradation level of sample 52?
Well, again, I don't think I can answer that because all I did was a slot plot on it, but I know that Dr. Cotton was able to get an RFLP result out of it, so that tells me it's not substantially degraded.
Well, the RFLP result, withdrawn. If an RFLP result can be obtained on as little as 25 to 30 nanograms of human DNA,
Something like that, yes.
all right? And that's at the low end of the system, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And ordinarily, a blood drop, a drop of blood, would contain how many nanograms of human DNA?
Sustained.
It's
Sustained.
just foundational and definition of degraded.
We've asked that question, I think, 4 or 5 times.
What would be your expectation? Withdrawn. in August of this year, you
Yeah.
performed an initial inspection of these swatches.
August of '94.
August of '94, I'm sorry.
Yes,
And you did a yield gel on some of these swatches.
yes,
And and you only did a slot blot after you did the yield gel.
that's correct.
And after looking at the yield gels, but before doing the slot blots, you offered some testimony with respect to your expectations as to how much DNA you would find in the Bundy blood drops.
I don't recall it being an expectation. I think at that point we had discussed potentially how much we had found. This is back in August, right?
And based on a yield gel, for example, for items, you were getting readings of as high as 150 nanograms of DNA, of high molecular weight DNA, based on the yield gel.
That's correct.
But you couldn't tell from a yield gel whether that DNA was bacterial or human.
That's correct.
And when you subsequently did the slot blot to find out how much human DNA was in the sample, you found out that it was substantially less than 150 nanograms.
Much less than 150 nanograms of human DNA, yes.
And what that did is that when you did that slot blot, you realized that there was a lot more bacterial degradation in these Bundy blood drops than even you had initially anticipated when looking at these swatches and doing your yield gels in August.
Yes.
Now, getting back to the question about proficiency testing, I take it you are agreeing that the proficiency tests that you received from Collaborative Testing Service and IQAS did not involve substantially degraded samples.
That's correct.
The California Association of Crime Labs proficiency tests, however, you know those did involve substantially degraded samples.
No foundation.
Sustained.
Do you know if the CACLD proficiency tests involve substantially degraded samples?
Action calls for hearsay, no foundation.
Oral.
Yes, I do know some of them were substantially degraded.
And in fact, when they, in preparation of the samples for the CACLD proficiency test, some of those samples were deliberately subjected to severe environmental conditions in order to degrade them.
That's my understanding, yes.
But the approach of CTS and IQAS in the proficiency tests that you take is not to intentionally degrade the samples.
I would agree with that.
And wouldn't you agree that in casework, laboratories such as yours are routinely encountering degraded samples in terms of performing your DNA analysis?
Objection, calls for conclusion, inadequate foundation, may call
Sustained.
for hearsay.
Why don't you rephrase the question?
All right. In your lab work, do you not encounter on a routine basis in your cases substantially degraded specimens for purposes of performing DNA analysis?
At times we do, yes.
And wouldn't you agree that it would be withdrawn? And wouldn't you agree that well-designed proficiency tests that are intended to duplicate what you actually get in casework ought to involve degraded samples?
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
Would you agree? Mr. Sims, I understand that you can only subscribe to those proficiency testing services which are available. Fair
Yes.
enough?
Yes.
Right. And these questions are really directed at the kinds of tests that are available for you to take.
Yes.
But in terms of the tests that are available for you to take, withdrawn. In terms of designing a proficiency test that would replicate, duplicate what your lab actually encounters in casework, wouldn't you agree it would be a good idea to have specimens that are degraded?
Irrelevant, no foundation. speculation, calls for speculation.
Overruled.
Well, I think it's a somewhat complex issue because on the one hand, when we're doing RFLP proficiencies, it only works with samples that are not substantially degraded. So if we're testing people for their RFLP ability, then it doesn't make sense to me to do work with degraded samples because you won't get an RFLP if it's substantially degraded. On the other hand, I see no problem with looking at degraded samples if you're going to look for PCR type results. And this whole issue of designing proficiency tests that fairly test all the laboratories is something that, is being worked out. There are some questions there about what different types of samples one may want to look at so that everybody is fairly tested. That's an issue.
Let's talk about mixtures and proficiency testing.
Okay.
In any of the open proficiency tests that you have done, were there mixtures of blood on a blood stain where one source contributed a considerably smaller amount than the other?
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
All right. Were there mixtures in any of these open proficiency tests that you took of blood stains where the contribution of one, you found out later, the contribution of one of the contributors was much greater than the contribution of a second or third contributor?
Have you done proficiency testing that involved mixed samples?
Yes.
All right. Have there been significant differences in the contributions that you were able to detect?
Yes, for example, on the sexual assault
No,
type evidence.
I'm asking about blood stains.
Blood stains.
I recall in the laboratory that there was one that was submitted where they tried to catch the lab as to whether or not they could detect two stains that were mixed like that. I think it was one of the CTS ones.
Where one of the contributions was much larger than the other one.
I think that was the scenario. Now, that was not done by me, but somebody else in our laboratory had one where I think that was the issue, whether or not they could detect this mixing.
Well, a mixture of saliva and blood or a mixture of blood and blood?
I think it was two bloods. I'd have to check, because again, that was not my personal test, but I think we had something like that come through the laboratory.
Which one would that be?
I don't know the numbers offhand. I'd have to go back to the lab and look into that.
Are you certain of that?
He just said he'd have to go back to the numbers.
All right.
That's argument.
Maybe, well, I'm only asking if you said, what you're telling us is you think that might be true, but you're not sure.
I'm not absolutely sure, but I have a recollection of that, yes.
Now, but you personally, for example, have taken no tests involving the mixtures of blood where one source contributes a much greater amount than another.
Where there were two blood samples mixed?
Yeah, blood.
No.
All right.
No.
And have you ever taken a proficiency test where you were trying to detect genotypes in a mixed blood stain where there was more than two contributors, where there was 3 or 4 contributors?
No.
But in this case, you've been asked to analyze blood stains that, at least the prosecution is claiming, has as many as 3 sources.
Yes.
And you have never taken a proficiency test, even an open proficiency test, that involves such a situation.
That's correct.
Now, wouldn't you agree that in terms of DNA typing, that particularly PCR-based typing, that mixtures present special problems?
Well, there's two things. You have to be able to detect the mixture, and then you have to be able to interpret the mixture.
Now, I noticed on direct examination that you never used any of these dot blot strips to explain how you got your results. Am I correct in that?
I don't think any dot plot results were presented.
Right. But that's how you got all these DQ alpha results using this dot plot strip.
That's correct.
All right. And what I asked is to have this marked defendants next in order.
1166. Have you shown that to Mr. Harmon?
Yeah. Now, what I'm going to put up on the Elmo here is, to start with, is just a dot blot strip. And what I'd like you to do, Mr. Sims, is explain to the jury, if we could go through it step by step, how one reads one of these strips.
Okay?
Now let's just
Back further, back further.
okay, why don't we just use for a second the one at the top that is labeled DNA 17C. Okay?
Okay.
That one's blank, right?
Okay.
And starting from the left to the right, could you please tell the jury, there are a series of numbers across this strip, correct?
Yes.
All right. And could you tell the jury what each of these numbers represents and how one gets a reading off one of these strips? And
Okay.
if, maybe, I should even use, we have one of those telestrator things. Maybe, we're trying to simulate a direct examination, Mr. Sims. Maybe you could come down and stand next to me or stand over here, and you know how to use this point maker now?
Yeah.
Sure better than I.
I'm sorry. There you go, Gary.
Okay, so starting with the one that says DNA 17, could you tell us what, starting on the left, what the 1 represents?
Okay. The 1 is for the overall type 1 probe. In other words, we'll talk later about the subtypes of the 1, but the first thing is that that's an overall 1 probe that's... Now keep in mind the probe in this case is already on the strip. That's what the manufacturer does. They provide you with a strip that has the probe already on it. You recall we talked about RFLP, we put the DNA onto the strip and then we hit it with the probe. Well, here we put the probe already on the strip, the probe is already on the strip, and now we hit it with the DNA. So you just, this is why it's called a reverse dot blot.
And wouldn't it be fair to say that the way this PCR-based method works is that you take you extract the swatches, right?
Right,
You cut them up, you put them in those test tubes, those little test tubes,
right,
and then you amplify up the DNA.
right.
And so what you're really doing is you're pouring that so-called amplified product over the strip.
Right.
And then when you pour the amplified product over the strip, you see which of these blue dots light up and which ones don't.
Right.
Okay. So what I take it you're saying is that starting on the far left-hand side of 17, the blank one, that there's a dot there that we can't see lit up, correct?
Say it again,
On
which
the
side?
blank one, the second one down,
Yes.
right? So
Right.
that's where you have the pointer right now. Now, underneath, right next to that one, there's a little piece of probe, right?
That's right. There's
And when
a
you-
dot of probe.
A dot of probe. When you pour the amplified product up, if there's any genotype that is part of the 1 system here, okay, that dot should light up.
That's correct.
And there are subtypes that we'll discuss as we go across the strip of the 1. There's a 1.1, a 1.2, and a 1.3.
That's correct.
Okay. Could you move to the right now? What's next to that 1?
Okay, the next one is for what we call the 2 allele. There would be a probe there.
Please use the second strip down, the one that doesn't have anything lit up.
Okay.
Okay? That's where the 2 would be.
That's where the 2 would be.
So if there was anybody that had a genotype for the 2 and you poured the amplified product on the strip, the blue dot should light up.
Yes.
Okay, moving to the right, what do we have?
That's the 3 probe right in that area.
So if we pour amplified product on the strip, and there's anybody that has a 3 allele, right, that should light up.
Yes.
All right, next.
This is the 4 probe allele right there.
So if we pour amplified product on the strip, and somebody has a 4 allele, that blue dot should light up.
That's correct.
All right, now what's this next dot?
Okay, this is an important dot right here. This is called the C, or control dot. And the point for the control dot is that tells you, first of all, that you had enough DNA on the sample to see both of the alleles if in a sample. In other words, there's enough DNA to get a result, a typing result. It also is useful in that it can be used to gauge the relative contributions of samples when you start to look at a mixture situation. And we'll talk about that, I think, later on if I'm guessing where you're going with this.
Oh, yeah, we'll talk about that.
But that's an important dot, is that C dot.
Well, let's talk about that just for 1 second, see if we understand this. So this C dot, they call that the all control, right?
Yes, that's what they used to call it, I believe.
And it has less probe on it than the other dots?
That's correct.
So the theory is that when you pour amplified product over this strip, that if this C dot lights up, right,
Yes.
then that means you're not missing any potential alleles, because if this dot lights up, then you should be detecting all the other potential alleles in the mixture.
In a non-mixed
Not
sample.
a non-mixed sample.
In a non-mixed sample, that's
Right.
important.
Now, of course, as we're going to get to in a second, when you have a mixture, that C dot has less utility as a control, doesn't it?
No, I think, for example, in Dr. Blake's article, he talks about using that as a convention, and looking at the intensity of the dots relative to the C. So I wouldn't say it's,
Well, let me put it to you this
Excuse me,
way.
counsel, you need to not interrupt his answer. You need not to talk at the same time.
Let me formulate the question for you this way. When you have a mixture and you pour the amplified product over the C dot can be lit up by the primary contributor of the mixture, correct?
that's correct.
And so if there is a secondary or a second contributor to the mixture, or a third contributor to the mixture, or even a fourth contributor to the mixture that have less DNA from those sources, are you with me?
Yes.
The C dot won't tell you about whether you're missing any alleles from the second and third and fourth contributor, because the C dot is being lit up by the primary contributor.
That's true.
And in that situation where you have such a mixture, the utility of the C dot control in terms of telling you whether you're seeing all the alleles is not as good as it would be where it was just one person.
Well, again, I mean, you can only talk about what you can see there, but your point is well taken, that you can't say much more about those very weak dots.
Okay. And of course, what we're dealing with in this case, as we'll discuss in a minute, are mixtures which involve at least 3 contributors according to the analysis the prosecution has put up here.
Well,
Could be 3.
could be 3.
Could be more, right?
We don't know exactly how many.
Okay. We'll discuss that in a minute. Now, so that's the C dot.
That's the C dot. That's the important C dot, right?
Right. Now, the next dot over to the right, what's that?
That's the 1.1 dot. So now we're getting into the subtyping of the 1 alleles, because the 1 allele can be broken down into the 1.1, the 1.2, and the 1.3.
And when you're seeing a 1.1, you should also see that 1 over at the left-hand side, right?
If that 1.1 is definitely due to a 1.1, you should, yes.
And when you make that caveat, if it's a real 1.1, sometimes in this system, there are limitations to this system.
Yes, I think I mentioned that on the direct examination.
And one of the problems that an analyst has with this system is sometimes these dots light up faintly, and it is difficult to tell whether the dot represents a real allele in the mixture, or it is what is, I guess, in your business called an artifact.
Yes, that's one of the limitations of the system.
And could you tell the jury what an artifact is?
An artifact would be, for example, if you're seeing some signal at one of these dots that's very weak, but it's not really part of the actual type.
So would it be a fair way to distinguish it is that sometimes you see a dot light up and you know it's real in the sense that it actually represents the DNA from the original source?
Well, that you really are seeing the type.
Really are seeing the type. And then sometimes these dots can light up and it's not real. It's an artifact.
If they're weak, that's true. If they're very weak, that's true.
Now let's move over to the next dot. Now this gets a little complicated, doesn't it?
Yes, this is where the system gets complicated. And the basic limitation is that there is not a unique probe for this 1.2 allele. So we don't have a single dot that says this is what you see light up if the 1.2 is there. So what you have to do is you have to do a little bit of logic here, and you have to do a little bit of logic to decide whether or not the 1.2 is there against the contribution here from the 1.3 or the contribution from the 4. And it's hard to do it without showing you an example, but I think you'll recall seeing a lot of my results where I said possible 1.2, possible 1.2. That's because you can't always say that the 1.2 is present. For example, if the 4 allele is definitely present, you may have trouble saying, could there be a 1.2 there also? That's why you saw a lot of those results in parentheses, and that's one of the limitations of the system, and I have to make the assumption that that result, that dot could be there, that type could be there, I just can't detect it in a mix.
Let me try to break it down as simple as we can for reading this particular dot. What that dot represents is that if that dot lights up, you could either have the 1.2 allele,
Yes,
you could have the 1.3 allele,
yes,
or you could have the 4 allele,
yes, or combinations thereof.
or combinations. But one way you can double check is if that dot lights up and the 4 dot lights up, you know that there's a 4.
That's correct.
And if this particular dot lights up and the 1.3 right directly to the right of it lights up, you know you have a 1.3.
Yes,
And then sometimes you might be lucky enough by process of elimination to determine if you have a 1.2.
that's correct.
Okay, moving over to the right, and this is a dot of some significance for your laboratory, I take it. That is the 1.3 dot.
Yes,
And if you have a 1.3 allele present, that dot should light up.
yes, if the 1.3 is there, you should definitely see that dot light up. Sometimes this is the one that is the most useful indicator of this cross-hide phenomenon that I talked about, because it's very, very close in its DNA sequence to some of the other alleles. And so if you see any of this weakness in the background, that could be an artifact. And that's one you really key on when you look at these types of strips.
So in other words, you anticipate I'm going to ask you some questions about interpreting this 1.3 dot, don't you?
Well, I had no idea you were going to say that. Of course.
There
yes,
were some
this is
problems.
This is a critical dot. I would agree with you.
And your laboratory does have some problems with this 1.3 dot lighting up persistently in lots of tests, and it's been hard for you to determine why that's happening.
Sustained.
All right,
Juries to disregard.
let's move on from the 1.3 dot. What's the one to the right of it?
That's called the all but 1.3, and that's used to distinguish if you have a situation where you're trying to distinguish the 1.3, 1.3 homozygote. That's what that dot is for. It's, again, part of the logic.
Right. Now, remember, we discussed, when we were discussing PCR carryover contamination,
Yes,
we had those charts out with the little pyramids,
yes,
all right? And we were discussing the number of those billions of fragments that we called amplicons.
yes,
And if you recall, we used an example where the starting material contained DNA that was 1.3, 1.3.
yes,
All right. Now, starting back to that pyramid where you have a sample that has 1.3, 1.3 in it, okay?
Okay.
Billions of little amplicons.
okay,
Right? What it would do in this particular strip, it would light up that 1.3 dot.
yes. If they all, now, you have to give me the exact conditions. They're all getting in there?
It's a 1.3, 1.3.
Contaminant?
No. So we'll get to contaminants in a
Okay.
minute. I'm talking about a situation where you have billions of fragments that were just 1.3, 1.3.
Okay.
Do you remember that?
Yes.
I'll pull out the chart.
No, I remember.
Well, I know you remember, but that's not the point.
No objection. Can we keep the comments down? Could you instruct Mr. Scheck?
No, we can also keep those comments down, too.
All right. This was the chart we were using to discuss the amplicons, correct?
Yes.
All right,
This
and
is defense exhibit.
that chart number is 1133. And on 1133, our hypothetical was we were starting with biological material that contained, for this DQ alpha system, 1.3, 1.3.
Okay.
And we discussed how on just one PCR run, you, in one of those little tubes, you would create 4,290,000,000 fragments of 1.3, 1.3. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
But again, I should point out that we're not talking about, in any case, with starting with just one fragment, right? You're saying theoretically you end up with billions of copies.
Right.
I'm comfortable with that, yes.
Now, if we had the scenario we were talking about the other day, sample is a 1.3, 1.3, how would it look on that chart? The 1 would light up in the far left-hand column, right?
Yes.
All right? And the 1.2, 1.34 dot would light up?
Yes.
The 1.3 dot would light up?
Yes.
But the all but 1.3 dot would not light up.
It should not light up if it's a 1.3, 1.3 homozygous type.
Now, in terms of PCR carryover contamination, if there were a problem of PCR carryover contamination at a laboratory, such that through repetitive typing, there was some 1.3 amplicons in the laboratory. Are you with me?
Yes.
That could account, in terms of typing, for the 1.3 lighting up persistently in various strips, even if faintly.
Oh, roll.
Well, again, that's why you run all those control strips, because those are all negative. That tells you that you're not seeing this consistent problem.
And that's why you also run quality positive control strips too.
Yes, that's one reason we run that too.
Okay. Now, okay, thank you very much for this. And maybe you could return to the stand and we'll move a little further here. So that's a thumbnail explanation of how to read these DQ alpha strips.
Yes.
Now, we were talking about mixtures and how to interpret them. You recall that?
Yes.
Now, there are different kinds of mixtures that DNA laboratories encounter in their casework.
Yes.
And the one that is been done, withdrawn. A very typical kind of case for a DNA laboratory involves a sexual assault case.
Yes, it does.
And a mixture in a sexual assault case, if, let's say, there's one perpetrator and one victim, ordinarily involves DNA from the sperm of the perpetrator
Yes.
and DNA from the epithelial cells of the victim.
Yes.
And the epithelial cells, those are like the skin cells?
Yes, those are in this case, you'd be talking about the cells that line the vagina.
Right. So what ordinarily happens in a sexual assault case is that a swabbing is taken from the victim of the rape, and on the swab there is evidence of sperm and also cells, epithelial cells from the vaginal wall of the victim.
Yes, that'd be typical.
And that's the typical kind of mixture that forensic DNA laboratories will encounter in such sexual assault cases.
Yes.
And when you're dealing with that kind of a mixture, you can do something that's known as a differential extraction, correct?
Yes.
And that's, literally what you can do is you can take the mixture and you can look at it under a microscope.
Yes.
And you can literally see the sperm cells there.
Yes, you can.
And then what you do in the differential extraction is you literally take some kind of a detergent and you pour it over the sample, correct?
Well, you don't just pour it over the sample. It's all done in a test tube.
It's done in a test tube,
Yes.
right? The fancy name for that is a lysis.
Yes, you do a lysis.
All right. But literally what that means is you first put in a detergent that is not as strong as a second detergent that you're going to put in, correct?
Well, it's a little more involved than that. What it really comes down to is...
Hold on. What's the relevance of this?
I'm going to tie this up in just a second.
Quickly.
Quickly. In a differential extraction in a sexual assault case, what you can do is first extract the DNA from the epithelial cells, correct?
Yes.
And you do that by literally pouring in this chemical, and that'll burst open the cells, the epithelial cells, and you can drain out the DNA from the victim.
Well, yes, basically what you're doing is, in this differential extraction process, is you're first getting out the DNA from the female contribution from her cells, while the sperm heads, until you add another reagent, the sperm heads, because their DNA is packaged differently, they are resistant to that first lysis that you mentioned. So the DNA stays with the sperm.
So then you can pour in a stronger chemical, and you do a lysis, or you burst open the sperm cells, correct?
Yes. Yes.
And so in that fashion, you can, with some assurance, doesn't always work perfectly, but with some assurance, you can separate the sperm DNA from the epithelial cell DNA from the victim.
Yes, again, it doesn't always work perfectly, but you can get an idea what the mix is that way.
And in that kind of a mixture situation, you can then sort of have a backup, because if you take a blood sample from the victim and you compare it to the reading you get from the epithelial cells, you have sort of a backup check to know that your process is working correctly.
Yes, that serves as a check.
And that is of considerable assistance in interpreting a mixture in a sexual assault case.
Yes, it's helpful.
And it's in some ways analogous to doing DNA testing in a paternity case, where you have backup systems where you know what the genotypes of the father is, and you know, or the putative fathers, and you know what the genotype of the mother is.
Well,
Let me withdraw that question. Let's just get to the bottom line here. Would you agree that mixtures involving bloodstains from 2 or 3 or 4 contributors, you cannot perform a differential extraction like you can in a sexual assault case?
that's correct.
You cannot put that bloodstain under a microscope the way you can in a sexual assault case and literally see the different kinds of cells that are contributing to that mixture.
That's correct.
If you have a mixture of a bloodstain and saliva together, you cannot look under a microscope to look at that bloodstain and see what cells come from saliva and what cells come from blood.
Well, now that's incorrect, because when you're talking about blood against blood, that's true. But saliva, as you mentioned when we were talking about sneezing, has these epithelial cells, and one could look under the microscope and make an extract of a blood stain, just like one would make an extract of a semen stain, and look at the microscopic the features that are there, and you might see that there are epithelial cells that could be attributed to saliva, for example.
Well, have you ever done that?
I think I did that in one case. I don't recall doing that in my DNA work, but I can recall doing some kind of micro exam on, for example, it's not unusual to look at a blood stain where there may be a blood and semen mix. That's not an unusual.
Well, I'm sorry. Are you
Wait.
finished, Gary?
Don't interrupt.
I didn't mean to interrupt him.
That would not be an unusual occurrence to have a blood-semen mixture, and so one would do a microscopic exam for that purpose.
There's no blood-semen mixture in this case, is there?
I didn't examine any of this evidence for semen.
Right. And in a blood-semen mixture, you're going to see sperm cells, right?
Well, depending on whether or not the person has sperm, I mean, maybe a vasectomized individual, for example.
When you have
Counsel, it's really, let's just go back to the blood mixtures, please.
Well,
We're not dealing with any other mixture here.
that's my point. Hey, did you examine under a microscope the bloodstain mixture to determine whether there was, you could see anything that you would attribute to the epithelial cells of saliva versus cells from bloodstains?
No, I did not do that.
All right. And you're actually saying that's something that you think could be done but wasn't done?
What I'm saying is that someone, if they wanted to, could run that test, yes.
Now, bottom line, would you agree that as opposed to a sexual assault case where there's a mixture of sperm from one contributor, non-vasectomized individual, and a vaginal swab from one victim, right, as opposed to that situation, interpreting DNA results from bloodstain mixtures where there are more than two contributors, all right, that second situation is a much more challenging application of this technology?
Well, it's more challenging in terms of saying what could go with whom, for example. That's true. Although sometimes even with those types of mixtures on RFLP, you may be able to sort something like that out.
But bottom line, the two or more contributor bloodstain mixture, to use simple terms, is harder in terms of trying to figure out who are the contributors.
I think in general that's true, yes.
Okay. 10:30 is the
10:30.
I'd like to move to the Bronco board.
Mr. Harris, you want to give Mr. Scheck a hand here?
This is prosecutions 260.
Thank you.
Now, you received swatches from the Bronco numbered 23, 24, 25, 29, 30, 31, and 34, correct?
I believe those numbers are all correct. Some of those, now 23 I don't think we analyzed, for example.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, 24, 25, 29, 30, 31, and 34.
Okay, the numbers you mentioned were 24, 29.
Yeah, I'm really starting from the top down to here to 34, correct?
Yes.
All right. And all those samples were collected on June 14th.
Sustained.
Do you know if all those samples, based on the writings that you received, were collected on June 14th?
I don't know that.
All right, I'm going to ask you to assume that all those samples were collected on June 14th.
Okay.
And you received another set of samples, 303, 304, 305, which were swatches from the console, correct?
Yes.
And those, I'd like you to assume, do you have any notations about when those were collected?
It was my understanding that they were collected later. I don't know the exact date.
I'd ask you to assume that those were collected in September,
Okay.
about 2.5 months after the first set of samples that we discussed were collected.
Sustained.
Well, maybe my month estimate is off. I'd ask you to assume that the first set of samples that we discussed up to 34 were collected on June 14, 1994, and then the second set of samples, 303, 304, 305 from the center of the console, were collected on September 1st, 1994.
Later. At a later date.
Well, I think that August 26th they were first examined. September 21st September 1st they were actually swatched by Mr. Matheson. Either way, August 26th, September 1st,
Later.
later. Now, looking at these samples, I'd like you to assume that number 30, it's labeled to your center console, was collected on June 14th, and number 303 was collected at a later date from the same area as 30.
Oh,
Okay?
The jury's heard the testimony as to how this was recovered.
Are you with me?
Okay, so you're talking about the same general area.
Same area.
Well, now, same to me means the identical spot.
We can only make our assumptions based on testimony from others, okay? I'd like you to assume
Sustained.
same area of the console.
Again, when you say same, how same are they, I guess is what I'm...
Your Honor, maybe I could break and I'll get some pictures. From the same stain.
All right, let's take our break now. Let you look at the photographs. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please remember all of my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions about the case.
Please keep the noise down.
Don't conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you. Do not allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. We'll stand in recess for 15 minutes. Mr. Simpson, you can step down. Mr. Scheck, why don't you find that board? All right.
To the smear that you see where 30 is in this photograph?
Yes, I see the posted. It looks like this is 30.
Right. So starting to, as I'm looking at it and the jury's looking at it, all right, the upper left hand, from the left going downward to the right, you see that streak? Yeah, where the arrow is pointing. From there down to where the 30 is, all right?
Yes.
All right, let's call that the area of 30, and 303 as being in the same area, okay?
Just, in other words, we're assuming it's right in that same area.
In that same area, Okay, and let me direct your attention to 31.
Okay.
Maybe we could have the arrow go there as well. And that area would be starting at the top. It's a little shadowed there, moving vertically down, okay?
Okay.
And let's assume that that 31 area is the same as 304. And now I'd ask to look at another photograph that we'd ask to be marked defendants next in order. There's 1167.
All right, 1167 appears
All
to
right.
be a photograph of the console on butcher paper.
Yes. And I'd like to assume that that last photograph I showed you, 1087, was a photograph taken on June 14th.
The one you just showed me before?
Yes, previously. Now, this is a photograph taken on September 1st.
Okay.
And I'd like to, why don't you assume that 306 is just is a hair and is not a stain, okay?
Okay.
And looking at the area, again, 303, you see the same area that we pointed out on the June 14th photograph, starting from the upper left hand, moving to the right, okay?
Objection, it's vague, and this states the testimony.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
All right. You see where the 303 label is?
Yes.
All right. I'd like you to look at the area to the left of 303 and assume that is the same area as 30 on the June 14th photograph.
It's vague, it may be inconsistent with the testimony in this case.
Oh,
as it's
I don't
vague.
think so.
Sustained.
All right. You see an area designated 303?
Yes.
All right. You see an area designated 304?
Yes.
All right. Now, okay. And you see an area below designated, the bottom of that designated 305.
Yes.
Now, with respect, looking at the result board, to
Equals 260.
the stain collected as number 30, which we've asked you to assume was done on June 14th, which I've also asked you to assume is the same area as the, let's just start this, 30 collected on June 14th. You had a DQ alpha typing of 1.1, 1.2,
Yes.
and a D1S80 typing of 2425,
Yes.
which you said excluded Ronald Goldman
Yes.
and excluded Nicole Brown Simpson,
Yes.
and was only consistent with Mr. Simpson,
Well, or someone with his
with his
types.
genotype.
Yes.
Excuse me. Counsel, you're talking over his answer again. The court reporters are almost in rebellion.
I'm sorry, Russian. Looking at 303, however, collected on September 1st, see that?
Yes.
There, you found on DQ alpha 1.1, possibly a 1.2, a 1.3, and a 4.
That's correct.
And a D1S80 is of 24, 25, and 18.
Yes.
Then on June 14th, as far as 31 is concerned, which would be collected, 31, you recall that
Yes.
stain?
Yes.
All right, on June 14th, you have a 1.1, 1.2, and what you're calling a weaker 1.34, correct?
Yes.
And a D1S80 of 2425.
Yes.
All right. But as far as on 304, which I'm asking you to assume was collected from the same area on September 1st. Okay.
Sustained.
All right. 304. The area designated 304.
Okay.
Here you have an additional DQ alpha reading D1SAD reading of 18,
Now, this is 304 compared to
31.
31. Yes.
And why don't we assume that 304 is from the same general area as 31?
Now, again, I guess we get into now the same general area. I think I understand that.
The area that we pointed to,
But again, in very broad terms.
Yes.
It's not necessarily the same area.
and on the 304 stain collected on September 1st, now the list of people not excluded extends in addition to Nicole Brown.
Yes.
And then on stain 305, you had the same genotypes.
Yes, that's correct on 304 and 305.
Now,
Although I'd like to add too, there was a little more definition, I think, in discriminating the mixture on the DQ alpha. You'll notice it says weaker 1.34 on 305 as opposed to 304. The same alleles are present, but there's a little distinction there as far as the patterns.
in your examination of those photographs of the smears on stains on June 14th and the photographs you saw of September 1st, could you tell whether there was more blood on the console on September 1st than there was on June 14th, just from looking at the photograph?
Cost of speculation, foundation.
Sustained.
Well, from your DNA testing, did you find more DNA in 303 than in 30?
I'd have to check my quantities on that. It's 304 versus 30?
303 versus 30.
303 versus 30. Give me 1 minute, please. Yes, I've reviewed the notes, and I did find more in 303 than 30.
30 you got by your slot blot 2.6 nanograms.
Yes, something like that. Again, that may be after quantitation, but it's in that ballpark.
And 303, 40.5 nanograms.
Yeah, again, it's in that ballpark.
And with respect to 31, something on the order of 2.1 nanograms
Again, I'd like to check my notes.
on your slot blot.
I'm sorry, you said how much?
2.1 on your slot blot.
That's correct, after quantitation.
And as far as 304 is concerned, 29 nanograms.
Let me check. That's about right, yes.
Now, in your opinion, as a forensic scientist, it is important to preserve the integrity of biological evidence, whether it is found in an automobile or on a street.
Yes.
And it is a good practice, withdrawn. Is it a good practice to permit individuals into an automobile for over 2 months before swatching the inside of an area for biological materials.
Sustained.
Well, do you think that it would be a good practice, in your opinion, of forensic scientists, to permit a car to be burglarized before you go in and swatch biological
Sustained.
material from the area?
Sustained. Jury is to disregard that characterization.
Well, do you agree that chain of custody principles apply to cars and their interiors just like any other piece of evidence?
Yes.
Now, looking just at the materials that I've asked you to assume were collected on June 14th, that would include 30 and 31 from the console, correct?
Okay.
And 29 from the steering wheel, correct?
Okay.
Now, with respect to 31, there was a problem, was there not, with the DQ alpha analysis of that stain?
Now this is with regards to 31.
31.
I don't think there was a problem. I think that was what I would classify as a tough call. We had to take a hard look at it, but I don't think there was a problem with the analysis.
Before we examine what you said was a tough call, would you not agree that with respect to the samples that were collected on June 14th, that there is no DQ alpha typing results of a 1.3 and a 4, putting aside 31, from any of the samples collected on June 14th, be it on the console or any other place in the Bronco?
Well, as represented by what's here,
Yes.
and say it again,
There is no DQ alpha typing results of a 1.3 allele and a 4 allele from samples collected on June 14th, be it on the console or any other place in the Bronco, and I'm excluding here 31.
well, to my knowledge on those samples, that's correct.
Okay. Now let's examine 31, which you have characterized as a tough call.
Yes.
Mr. Scheck, you need to flip that around. Unless you're going to use it immediately.
I'd ask that this be marked defendant's next in order. Oh, this is already marked? Do we have a number on this, Howard? Show you what's been marked as defendant's 1166. Do you recognize that as a photograph of DQ alpha strips for analysis you made of stains from the Bronco?
This, I believe, is a photograph that Dr. Blake took of the,
Do you have one of your own there?
yes, I do.
Can I see that? Would you see any differences between those photographs? Do you have a preference as to which one to use?
I'd have to look at it for a minute. I recall Dr. Blake was present for this reading. I don't know if he took the photo at that exact time, but I think he did.
Well, the photograph that I showed you was a little larger, isn't it?
Yes, it's an enlargement.
Would you, for purposes of analysis and for being able to show this, do you have any problems from a scientific point of view using the photograph I've showed you? And please examine the two of them.
Yes, just, I'd like a second to
Please
examine
do.
it. Okay,
Okay?
it's okay.
Maybe what we could do is you could have your photograph in front of us and you put 1166 on the envelope. Okay, now,
I think we need to back out just a little.
I think for our purposes, actually, this is the right shot. Now, let me call your attention to what is marked on the right-hand section of the strip. That is called DNA-18.
Okay,
Now, that is, that corresponds to LAPD item number 31.
yes,
All right. That is the strip where you're, the one that you're characterizing as the tough call, correct?
yes,
And in terms of reading that strip, you see at the 1.3 dot a light dot. Would that be a, how would you describe that? Faint?
well, I would describe it as a dot of about equal intensity to the C dot. Remember, we talked about how important the C dot is, and that intensity was scored on that day, that reading, as C. And what we do when we do one of these strips is we score the dots in relationship to the C dot. So you first look at the intensity on the C dot, and you call that C. It sounds very simple, but anyway, you call that C, and then you judge the relative intensities of the other dot. We call them C plus or C minus, and then we also have a category where we call them very faint or trace. So that was scored as a C.
Well, when you scored it as about equal to the C dot, correct?
Yes, it was scored as a C, which is this, what we're saying is about equal to the C dot.
And what you're actually saying is that you feel confident that the dot to the right of the 1.3 and what's labeled DNA 18, correct?
Yes,
Is as intense as the C dot.
yes, as far as our scoring was concerned, we considered that to be about the same intensity as the C dot.
Could a reasonable scientist look at that and say, maybe it's a little less intense than the C dot?
Sustained.
Well, would you agree that the scoring of a dot that faint is subjective?
I don't think it's really subjective in the sense that we are making an objective judgment about that intensity. We're also having a second person read it. So I don't think it's subjective. I wouldn't use that definition.
Well,
We felt it was present.
Now, this would be one of those situations where the C dot could be lit up by the primary contributor,
That's correct.
and the C dot is not necessarily indicating anything about whether you're missing dots or alleles from other contributors.
I can only call what I see.
Now, I call your attention to, if we could move the stand a little bit, to the lane that's QC 816.
Okay?
Now, that is the quality control sample that you run.
Yes.
And I realize that it's hard to see on the Elmo, but looking at the actual photograph of the dot blot that you have,
Yes.
and looking at your own scoring of this, at the 1.3 dot, you see a hint or a trace
Yes,
of an allele.
Yes, I think on that particular scoring, the first reader called it a hint. I called it an outline, which means it's even, in my mind, even weaker than just a hint. But it's definitely a very, very, very faint reading.
But
It's,
that's
in
on,
fact, excuse me, on the Elmo, I don't even think you
It's
can
hard to
really
see.
see that.
Your Honor, we're going to review this, and then we're going to show the actual photographs to the jury.
Right,
It
but you
can't
need
be
to-
seen other way.
But you need to stop talking at the same time.
Okay. Now let me move you down to the positive control. Move back a second, and could you, Mr. Harris, actually, could you, first, moving back to, if we go up to DNA 18,
Okay.
could you put an arrow by the 1.3 dot there? Up, further up, that, right there, underneath that. That's the 1.3 that you're calling in LAPD item 31, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now let's move down, take the arrow down to the QC 816 and put it underneath the 1.3 dot. That's the 1.3 dot that you say, that one reader scored as a hint and you scored as an outline on your quality assurance sample 816, correct?
Yes.
All right, now let's move down a little further. Oh, you got to print that, okay.
May I see your photo, Mr. Simpson? Thank you.
Okay. Now moving down to the next, you see where it says positive control?
Yes.
All right. Now the positive control is the sample that you run in every strip, correct? Every run.
Yes.
And that's supposed to be just a 1.14.
That's correct.
And the positive control in this case, again, was scored as having a hint or a trace of the 1.3 dot.
Well, again, let me look at the actual notes. Yes, that was scored as a hint.
All right, could we print that as well? Okay. Now, in your protocol, you have a section that deals with what's known as the allelic control.
Yes.
And the allelic control in this case would be what's known as the positive control on this run.
Well, in this particular case, in other words, when we know the type, yes, that is the control for that.
Would you even say that the quality control sample 816 would also be considered an allelic control for this run?
Well, no, I would consider that a blind because we don't know, the analyst does not know what the correct type of that sample is. So in other words, we have to make a determination and then we submit that for review to see whether or not we made the right call.
So in other words, in your protocol, when the term allelic control is used, it's only referring to the positive control, not to QC 816?
Well, I think you're talking the protocol now or the quality assurance manual?
Protocol.
I don't think we use the term allelic control on the protocol. Could you show me specifically?
Yes, do you have your protocol there, or?
If you have a copy, I'd
I
appreciate
should-
it.
That would make it faster. And this, Mr. Harmon, is at page 200119 of the materials. It's page 92 of your protocol. Is entitled Controls for PCR Analysis.
Well, okay, this is where had a misunderstanding, because this is the quality assurance manual. This is not the DQ alpha protocol.
Okay?
That's the distinction.
I'm sorry. In your quality assurance manual, you have a section that deals with allelic controls.
Yes.
And the allelic controls would be referring to certainly the positive control here.
Yes.
And would it also be, would you also consider QC816 an allelic control?
I wouldn't use that definition for it, but it is one of the controls we run. Again, it's blind, so you can't, the analyst doesn't know the correct type, so the analyst can't use that information to say, yes, this test is working properly, and that's what a control is. That comes later with the review.
All right. So just dealing with the positive control then, in your protocol, you rely on this allelic control section of the protocol, do you not?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And in the allelic control section of your protocol, does it not state this sample, and here we'd be talking about the positive control that's depicted on the Elmo, is a positive control that ensures that the amplification and typing process are working properly. To control for differential amplification, the allelic control should include an allele that is sensitive to amplification conditions in this system. For DQ alpha, a type 1.14 control is to be amplified with each amplification run and typed with each set type, correct?
That's correct.
And all that is saying that this allelic control is what's known as the positive control here, correct?
Yes.
And then at the end of this section of your protocol, it goes on to state, if the allelic control fails to give the correct result, the analysis must be repeated.
That's correct.
And in this instance, the allelic control showed evidence of a 1.3 dot, did it not?
No, I would say it showed that there was some cross-hybridization, very faint at that particular location, or at least a hint of it.
Did it not show the 1.3 dot lighting up at some intensity?
At that very low level of intensity, yes, there was something there.
And it showed the 1.3 dot also lit up on your quality control sample 816.
Well, again, I think when you say lit up, in other words, do we see a hint of activity there? Yes, we did.
Okay. And would you not agree that with respect to the sample 31, or your DNA 18, that the 1.3 dot in that sample is also certainly faint?
Well, I think you're misstating the interpretation of these bands, or these strips,
Excuse
because...
me, Your Honor, I'd move to strike. This answer is not responsive. I asked him a simple
No,
question.
no, don't interrupt the answer.
I asked him if it was faint. That's all I asked him. Is it faint?
Is it faint?
I wouldn't score that as faint, no.
All right. Can he explain?
He'd be allowed to, and I'm sure you'll ask him.
Yes, the last printout is 1166B. Now, as far as 1166 is concerned, could you please, since these are faint, I'd like the jury to see them. Could we mark on the lane that is DNA 18 with an arrow, just point an arrow there and indicate, and after that indicate 1.3. And then on the sample 816, the quality control, could you put an arrow there and indicate, write down 1.3? No, it's just an arrow marking what to look at.
What? That's fine.
Go ahead, would you please mark 1.3?
Well, why would I mark 1.3 when I didn't make a determination that there's 1.3 there?
I'm only asking you to mark
Look
on
at that
that
location.
1.3.
Oh, okay.
Directing your attention to that location.
Okay.
And then on the positive control, or the allelic control, could you please mark the 1.3?
Yes.
Okay.
I've done that.
All right, Your Honor, could I have this passed to the jury?
May I see that, please?
Sure.
I think we need to do it without the Post-its as well. Sure.
Objection, he's written something down that's not there.
Overruled. It's merely to direct the viewer's attention to that location. Proceed.
Actually, Mr. Harmon misstates. He says there's something there.
Excuse me, counsel.
All right.
I didn't ask for a comment. Proceed. Hand the exhibit to juror number 1, please.
So you would agree, Mr. Sims, that in terms of
Excuse
the...
me, counsel.
Yes.
Do you have my permission to ask another question before you hand that?
No. My apologies. I've been informed for the record, I should say 1166A is a printout.
There, we have 2.
While the jury's looking at it, maybe we can save some time by approaching on another exhibit. If you want.